So what is the hardest from Sulfur Souls game on New Game Plus? Now I've seen a lot of rankings of Souls games by difficulty, and it makes sense. One of the main course of conversation with these games is the difficulty, but I have never seen them ranked on New Game Plus. And I think New Game Plus completely changes the ranking. Some of the easiest Souls games become some of the hardest, and some of the hardest become the easiest. Now I have over 500 hours in all these games, and I have done multiple New Game Plus playthroughs. And I'll get into reasons why I think some are harder than the others, but we'll be ranking them from easiest to hardest. But let's get into ranking. I don't want to waste more time. So in last place, you could say the easiest, I have Securo. Now I know a lot of people consider Sekiro to be an incredibly hard game. Now I think it can be very hard on a first playthrough for multiple different reasons. One, getting used to the combat. It's very different than other Souls games. I can understand why someone would get stuck to it since it is different. Two, collecting all the prayer beads. You might be under leveled for a boss without knowing it. And the bosses do have some gimmicks to them that will be hard to get down. You need to practice the rhythm like every Souls game, but it can be challenging. But on New Game Plus, once you know the rhythm, once you have the appropriate amount of prayer beats, every single boss is essentially a joke. I haven't played Sekiro as much as the other Souls games. I have only replayed it 4 times. And every single time I have replayed it, I have barely died because I just do New Game Plus. It is just incredibly easy unless I'm fighting a new boss. A new boss, of course, it will still take me a few tries because I still got to figure out the rhythm. But after I figure out the rhythm, it's just an absolute breeze to get through. I think the mini bosses and the areas are super easy to navigate through once you have all the tools. The bosses are super easy once you have all the tools available to you. I just really don't see much of a challenge in this game after New Game Plus. I think first playthrough can be incredibly hard, but this is not a rating of burst on first playthrough. It's based on New Game Plus, and I think Sekiro is probably the easiest after New Game Plus 1. But it is interchangeable with the next placement because I think the next placement is also incredibly easy on New Game Plus. Next up, I have Elden Ring. Now, Elden Ring is kind of in a similar boat as Sekiro. I think first playthrough can be incredibly challenging. Now, I know people say Elden Ring is really easy. I never agreed with that. I think Elden Ring is probably one of the hardest Souls games, if not the hardest Souls game for me on my first playthrough. I know you can get OP in the game, but I never look up guides. I just make my own builds, and the end game bosses are still incredibly challenging. But that's exactly what makes Elden Ring one of the easier Souls games. After first playthrough, once you go to New Game Plus, you have your full build set up almost the entire game until the end game is basically a joke. You can almost one-shot the bosses. The scaling is very weak. The enemies don't get much stronger, and you have a build that you beat the final boss with, so you'll be incredibly fine. It will not be a challenge to you until the very end, and that's why I believe Elden Ring is one of the easier ones. Once you have your build, and that's the hardest part of getting an Elden Ring, setting up a build. Well, once you have that set up, it's just really not an issue. Of course, some of the bosses will still give you trouble towards the end, and that's why it's higher than Secure, but the majority of the game will be completely easy. Next up, I have Dark Souls 3. Now, does Dark Souls 3 have an incredibly hard New Game Plus? No, I wouldn't say so. I think it is pretty challenging, but I wouldn't say it's one of the hardest, hence why it's lower on the list. But I definitely believe that it's much harder than Elden Ring and Sekiro. I feel like in New Game Plus of Dark Souls 3, the game starts to pick up at around Abyss Watchers, and after Abyss Watchers, you'll definitely feel the impact of the attacks of the enemies, of the bosses. You might be struggling a bit if you don't know the moves or the areas pretty well. Now, the main reason that Dark Souls is above Elden Ring and Sekiro is, like I said, I believe the difficulty is much more harsher on you on New Game Plus. Even towards the beginning, even though I don't think it feels necessarily hard, I would understand if someone said they died in the early section on New Game Plus, because you don't do a crazy amount of damage like you would do at the beginning of New Game Plus of Elden Ring. I feel like in the beginning of Elden Ring, I could just one-shot everything. Now, I will say this, the end game of Elden Ring, I would say, picks up harder than the end game of Dark Souls 3 does. But since Dark Souls 3 just picks up a lot quicker, and Elden Ring is completely easy for about 80% of the game, it's just hard for me to justify putting Elden Ring above it. But we are still in the early half, so I would say the scaling of New Game Plus is still pretty lenient on all these 3 games, but this is how I would rank them so far. Number 4, I have Bloodborne. Now, Bloodborne is where I would say things get noticeably harder from a New Game Plus compared to base game. You can feel the impact of the enemies right off the bat. You can feel, oh my god, these guys hit harder than they did before. And it's a great feeling. If you want a difficulty in New Game Plus, I would say Bloodborne is where things start to really kick in and you start to enjoy it. Now, one of the main reasons that Bloodborne is higher than Dark Souls 3 is because limited items, for example, blood vials and bullets, you have to regain them. And with the New Game Plus scaling of the enemies doing way more damage, the boss doing way more damage, you're probably going to be struggling more than you did your first playthrough on some areas and some bosses. For example, I know Rum can one-shot you on New Game Plus if you're not careful with a bunch of his moves. Even the spiders have one-shotted me on New Game Plus. I don't think that was New Game Plus 1, but you can get heavily damaged based on these. And then you have to go grind for blood vials, for bullets, which can be a tedious process, which just naturally make it harder than Dark Souls 3, Elden Ring, and Sekiro. and the damage ramp up and everything else combined that I mentioned make it this one of the harder ones on this list so far. Number 3, I have Dark Souls 2. Now, if this was a list of the best New Game Pluses, Dark Souls 2 would be number 1. Now, does it have some issues? Yes, of course it does. But the fact that this game took a new approach to New Game Plus is absolutely awesome. I love that you get new interactions, new enemies, new bosses, kind of, from doing New Game Plus. Is absolutely fantastic. I hope another Souls game in the future does this, because it gives you motivation to do New Game Plus more than the other Souls games. Now, trying out a new build or just having harder enemies because of a stat boost is nice, but I just don't believe a stat boost is enough for me to want to replay a game over and over again, especially when I feel like they don't get much harder. And Dark Souls 2, not only do the enemies get a stat boost, but there's also new enemies and new interactions. Like I said, some sections they do overdo it. For example, having to fight the Lost Sinner while there's 2 pyromancers in your face nuking you is a bit of a pain in the butt. Nah, I will say this. You could argue that Dark Souls 2 is harder than some of the ones that we have coming up on the list, because the other ones we have just have a stat boost. Those stat boosts are absolutely massive and crazy, I will say. But some would argue that new enemies and new placements are going to be harder than stat boost. And I'm honestly down to hear that argument, but this is what I'm feeling right now. But if you disagree, let me know. At number 2, I have Dark Souls 1. Now, from this point on in the video will be very simple to make, to be honest. It won't be complicated at all, because the reason that these two are number 1 and 2 is quite simple. It's because of the stat boost the enemies get is literally insane. On my first playthrough, Dark Souls 1 was one of the easiest Souls games that I had played. I played it in 2018 with the remastered edition. I had been very excited. I had already played Dark Souls 3, 2, and Bloodborne on release. I wanted to play Dark Souls 1 finally. I got into it. I beat it quickly. I went into New Game Plus. I was like, okay, I beat this quickly. Let me replay it again. I got my ass beat so hard by enemies that I completely destroyed first playthrough. Almost everything in the game is going to 2-shot you. If you're lucky, you're going to get 3-shotted. And that's why Dark Souls 1 is super high on the list. Of course, the areas and everything in Dark Souls 1 can be challenging, because the older Souls game focus on areas more than they did with bosses. And the enemies will now 1-shot you or 2-shot you, or if you're lucky, like I said, 3-shot you. So that's why Dark Souls 1 is so high on the list. And finally, at number 1, I have Demon Souls. Now, I want to say this. Demon Souls is by far the easiest Souls game in the entire franchise when you're first playing it. If you tell me that Demon Souls is top 3, I will call you a liar. I would say it's the easiest. But New Game Plus completely changed my perspective on Demon Souls. This game went from the easiest Souls game to the most difficult. I'm telling you, I beat the game just like Dark Souls 1. I was like, oh, let me do another playthrough. That was way too quick. I get into the game, and every single enemy was a threat. I felt like every single enemy was a boss fight. I love upgrading my health so I can trade hits with the enemies. And of course, I did that in Demon Souls. I could not trade hits with anybody in Demon Souls, let alone bosses. Even the enemies I couldn't trade hits with. Like, what the hell was going on? Once you make it to the Prison of Hope and you're fighting the squid motherfuckers, they hit you once, you're dead. You basically have to know that area. And that's not the only area. This goes on for multiple different areas. So I definitely believe that Demon Souls has the hardest New Game Plus. These areas, these bosses, man, they go crazy in New Game Plus. And that's it for my ranking of the Souls games on New Game Plus. Now, I will say this ranking will definitely vary depending on the person, so let me know what you think about this. I was talking to one of my friends earlier, and they thought Elden Ring actually had one of the hardest New Game Pluses, which was really surprising to me. So, opinions will definitely vary. But from my experience, I tried my best to explain my reasonings. But let me know how you would rank it, and if you enjoyed the video, make sure to like and subscribe. I have way more Souls videos, so feel free to check those out too.